So now we're going to turn our attention to the structure and the functionality of the client classes in the QuoteServices app case study. And this is going to apply both for the Handy application and the Zippy application. So both of those are going to be covered by what we're going to discuss here. And as usual, you can get all this code in the EX4 project in my web MVC folder in my live lessons GitHub repository. We're also going to talk here about how to apply retrofit to create Java proxy methods automatically for the API gateway HTTP APIs. And this is a really fascinating topic, and I'm going to talk about it here, and I'm going to give you some pointers to other resources to look at for more information about how to do this effectively. So we'll start out by taking a look at the QuoteClient class. And we're going to use this class, the driver here, will perform synchronous remote invocations on the API gateway microservice to obtain Handy and Zippy quotes from the respective microservices using the QuoteClient. So you can see here, it's got a bunch of methods that are essentially the methods that are called by the driver program. This is a component using the component annotation, which allows Spring to auto-detect everything as it needs to. We're going to auto-wire the proxy, the QuoteProxy, to the QuoteClient. And the QuoteProxy is going to do all the heavy lifting here. There's a bunch of methods here. For example, there's post quotes, which as you can see takes the microservice, the Zippy microservice or the Handy microservice, and the list of quote IDs, and it will go ahead and make a call to make the API gateway get that result back. And then there's also, for example, search quotes, which is going to take the appropriate service, the Handy service, or the Handy service, or the Zippy microservice, and it's going to take a list of queries, and it's going to go ahead and find anything that matches in that list of queries from the designated microservice. You'll notice that all these methods do is they just forward to the QuoteProxy methods, which actually do all the work. They're the things that do all the heavy lifting, and we'll talk about how they function in just a moment. So that's QuoteClient. That's just to kind of make things clean and easy to work with from the test driver point of view, from the client point of view, client application point of view. Let's talk next about the QuoteAPI interface. And this is quite interesting. So we talked a bit about QuoteProxy. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. But first, I want to talk about how QuoteProxy uses Retrofit, which is a really cool mechanism that turns an HTTP API into a Java interface, thereby shielding clients from the details of invoking remote method invocations via HTTP. And you can see here, this is what the QuoteAPI looks like. So it's basically got essentially the same methods we have for the QuoteClient and the QuoteProxy, but there's a few subtle differences, and it uses Retrofit, which is a kind of a platform independent way of generating proxies declaratively. Here is what a Retrofit enabled interface looks like. So you can see here, this is called QuoteAPI. It's just a good old interface, and it's got a bunch of methods that are proxy methods that mimic as much as possible the signature of the controller methods that are running in the API gateway. So we have get all quotes and post quotes and search EX and so on. And then it's got a whole slew of retrofit annotations that are similar but not identical to the Spring controller annotations. So rather than things like get mapping or post mapping, we have get and post. Rather than things like request body, we have at body. And rather than request param, we have at query, and so on and so forth. But otherwise, it's very similar in a lot of ways to what you get for the Spring controller annotations. And in fact, as we'll see in a moment, they're so similar, we can automatically generate one from another using ChatGPT. And I'll talk about that momentarily. All of these proxy methods that Retrofit will be able to generate for us automatically return something known as a call objects. And the call objects can be executed to interact with the API gateway, to do the work that is being passed from the client to the API gateway. Now, what's cool about this is you can use ChatGPT to automatically generate the quote API from the base controller. This shouldn't say QuoteProxy, it should say quote API. So it automatically can generate the quote API from the controller. And if you want to see how that works, you just take a look at this video that I linked at the bottom below. And this is also linked as part of the assignment 2A video that walks through how this works. And I show how you can take a base controller or any kind of controller, and then with a few simple steps, you can automatically generate, or you can get ChatGPT to automatically generate the corresponding quote or the corresponding interface that's retrofit based. So really, really cool. Saves a ton of time, not hard to do at all. ChatGPT 4 does a wonderful job of doing this. And as far as I can tell, it's flawless. So let's talk about the QuoteProxy class. Now that we've talked a bit about how the Quote API works for retrofit and how the Quote client works, let's talk about the Quote proxy. So Quote proxy uses the auto-generated retrofit Quote API interface to abstract details of making remote method invocations using HTTP. So here's what Quote proxy looks like. Again, it has very similar signatures to what we saw before. The difference being that now we're dealing with lists, not calls to lists. We auto-wire the Quote API here, and we get an instance of the Quote API by using a bean in our client beans class, which is part of our common package. And this can be injected using Spring auto-wiring. And this particular implementation, once again, uses boilerplate code, which I got ChatGPT to generate for us quite trivially. If you watch the video, you see how that works. And this will create a Quote API retrofit client that's used to make these requests to the gateway application microservice. Here is what the proxy methods look like. And once again, you can pretty much do this as paint by number. In fact, you could probably get ChatGPT to do this for you. I haven't tried that, but it wouldn't be hard, I don't think. So here's what they do. This is one example. This is the post quotes proxy method that shields clients from low-level details of HTTP programming, including retrofit programming, by the way. So we're going to pass in the service name, the quote IDs, and the parallel flag. That's what's going to be encoded and passed to the API gateway. This is the actual call to the post quotes method on the quote API. That returns a call object, and the call object, when called, generates the URL that we show down at the bottom, encoding things based on what retrofit does. And then we're going to make a call to this little utility method called execute call. And that will, as we'll see in the next slide, execute the call and return the list of quote objects received from the server if all goes well, or it'll throw an IO exception if things go awry. So here's what the call utilities execute call method looks like. Call utils is a Java utility class that defines a method that we want to use here with retrofit to avoid having to rewrite a ton of boilerplate code. And you can see here, we're going to take a call object, a generic call object, and it's going to factor out common code to invoke a call and handle the response. Here's what it does. It calls execute on the call object, which gets back a response after making the call to the API gateway. And then if the response indicates success, we return the body, which is of type T. We get back the result on success and all is well. If something goes awry and we don't get back something successful, then we take the error message, wrap it up in an IO exception, and throw that IO exception back to the client. This is on the client side, by the way. This is all client code now. And we wrap this up with a rethrow supplier exception laundering technique that I like to use because I can't stand Java checked exceptions in modern functional Java code. So I use this all the time. You can read this Stack Overflow article for more information about how this works. It's a pretty cool idea. So that's the end of the walkthrough of the client side classes for this case study.